Hey, good afternoon. It's April Fool's Day, but this is no joke. I'm going to read Curious George again today, but today Curious George is riding a bike. This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey and always very curious. This morning, George was curious the moment he woke up because he knew it was a special day. At breakfast, George's friend said, "Today we're going to celebrate because just 3 years ago this day, I brought you home with me from the jungle. So tonight I'll take you to the animal show, but first I have a surprise for you." He took George out to the yard where this big box was standing. George was so curious. Out of the box came a bicycle. George was delighted. That's what he had always wanted. He knew how to ride a bicycle, but he had never had one of his own. "I must go now," said the man, "but I'll be back in time for the show. Be careful with your new bike and keep close to the house while I'm gone." You think George listened? George could ride really well. He could do all sorts of tricks monkeys are good at. He could ride this way with both hands off the handlebar. He could ride this way like a cowboy on a wild bronco. He could even ride backwards. But after a while, George got bored and tired of doing all the tricks. So he went out into the street. The newsboy was just passing by with his bag full of papers. "It's a fine bike you have there," he said to George. "How would you like to help me deliver the paper?" He handed George the bag and he told them to go down one side of the street first and then back up the other side. George was very proud as he rode off with his bag. There he goes, off to deliver newspapers. So here he is in the neighborhood. He started to deliver the papers on one side of the street, as he had been told. When he came to the last house, he saw a little river in the distance. George was curious. He wanted to know what that river was like. So instead of turning back, what did he do? Instead of turning back to deliver the rest of the papers, he just went on. Down to the river he went. There was a lot to see at that river. A man, he was fishing from the bridge. A duck family was paddling downstream. And 2 boys were playing with their boats. George would have liked to stop and look at the boats, but he was afraid the boys might find out that he had not delivered all of his papers. So he kept on going. While riding along, George kept thinking of the boats all the time. It would be such fun to have a boat. But how could he get one? He thought, and then, he had an idea. He got off his bicycle and he took a newspaper out of the bag. First he folded down the corners like this. Then he folded both edges up. Then he brought the ends together. Then he flattened it sideways. Then he turned one corner up. Then he turned the other one up. Again, he brought the ends together. Then he flattened it sideways. Then gently he pulled the ends up. And look what he had. A boat. Now the moment had come to launch the boat. Would it float? Well, it sure did. So George decided to make some more boats. Finally, he had used up all of the papers. And he had so many boats that he couldn't even count them. He had a whole fleet. Oh my gosh, look at all those boats. The ducks are having a blast. Even the butterflies, bugs, crickets, grasshoppers. Watching his fleet sailing down the river, George felt like an admiral. But watching the fleet, he forgot to watch where he was going on his bicycle. Look at him looking at the boats, not paying attention. Hop, clunk. Suddenly, there was a terrible jolt. The bike had hit a rock. George flew off the seat head first. Luckily, George wasn't hurt, but the front wheel of the bike was all out of shape and the tire was blown out. George tried to ride the bicycle, but of course it wouldn't go anywhere. So he started carrying it, but soon it got too heavy. George did not know what to do. His new bike was spoiled. The newspapers were all gone. He wished he had listened to his friend and kept close to the house. Now he just stood there and he cried. Look at him crying up there. That's what he gets for not listening. Suddenly his face brightened. Why, he had forgotten that he could ride on one wheel. He tried it and it worked. Look at him riding on the back wheel again. He had hardly started out again when he saw something. Here he comes riding. He saw he had never seen before. Rolling toward him came an enormous tractor with huge trailers behind it. Looking out of the trailers, all sorts of animals. To George, it looked like a zoo on wheels. The tractor stopped, and two men jumped out. "Well, well," said one of the men, "a little monkey who can ride a bike bronco fashion. We can use you in our animal show tonight. I'm the director of the show, and this is Bob. He can straighten your wheel and fix that flat in no time, and then we'll take you along to the place where the show's going to be." So they loaded up the bike, and they loaded up George. So the three of them got into the cab, and they drove off. "Maybe you could play a fanfare while you ride your bike in the show," the director said. "I have a bugle for you right here, and later on you'll get a green coat and a cap just like Bob's." On the showgrounds, everybody was busy getting ready for the show. "I must do some work now," said the director. "Meanwhile, you may have a look around and get acquainted with all the animals, but you must not feed them, especially the ostrich. He will eat anything, and he can get really sick afterwards." So of course, you know Curious George. He was curious. Would the ostrich really eat anything? He wouldn't eat a bugle, would he? George went a little closer to the cage where the ostrich was, and before he knew it, that ostrich had snatched up that bugle and tried to swallow it. But a bugle's hard to swallow, even for an ostrich. It got stuck in his throat. Funny sounds came out of the bugle as the ostrich was struggling with it, and he got all blue in the face. George got frightened. Fortunately, the men had heard the noise. They came running to the cage and got the bugle out of the ostrich's throat just in time. Look at him yanking that bugle out of his throat. The director was really angry with George. "We cannot use little monkeys who do not do as they're told. Of course, you cannot take part in the show now. We will have to send you home." George had to sit on a bench all by himself, kind of like a timeout bench. And nobody even looked at him. He was so sorry for what he had done now, but it was too late. He had spoiled everything. Looks like the ostrich is curious as George is. Meanwhile, that ostrich, he's always hungry. He had gotten a hold of a string dangling near the cage. This happened to be the string which held the door to the cage of the baby bear. As the ostrich nibbled at it, the door opened, and that baby bear got out. He escaped. He ran away as fast as he could and made straight for a high tree near the camp. Nobody had seen it but George, and George was not supposed to leave his bench. But this was an emergency, so he jumped up, he grabbed the bugle, and blew it as loud as he could. Then he rushed to his bicycle. The men had heard the alarm and thought at first that George had been naughty again, but when they saw the empty cage and the ostrich nibbling at the string, they knew what had happened. George raced towards that tree, far ahead of the men. By now the bear had climbed clear to the top of the tree, quite high, where it was dangerous. Because little bears, they can climb up a tree easily, but coming down is so much harder for the bear. They may fall and get hurt. The men were really worried. They did not know how to get him down safely, but George, he had a plan. He used his bag over his shoulder. He went up the tree as fast as only a monkey could, and when he reached the baby bear, look at him climbing up that tree. put him in his bag, and he carefully let him down so that the men could safely catch him. Everybody cheered when George had come down from the tree. "You're a brave little monkey," said the director. "You saved the baby bear's life. Now you'll get your coat back, and of course you may ride your bike and play the bugle in the show." George is happy now. Finally, the show was on. The whole town had come to see it, and how surprised they were. Right in the middle of it, to discover George on his bike, right in the middle of it. The newsboy was there too, and also the man with the yellow hat, who had been looking for George everywhere and was so happy he had found him at last. The newsboy was glad to have his his bag back again, and the people from the other side of the street whose papers George had made into boats, they weren't angry with him anymore. When the time had come for George to say goodbye, the director let him keep the coat and the cap and the bugle, and George and his friend got in the car, and they went home. I hope you enjoyed it.